This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
Okay, so very stimulating conversation last time on the common good. I'd like to clarify a couple of things that came up. Um, One is, Charlie, I think you what's the term? You uh, it's not that you had to hang up, but when Father Brad talked about the common good as a metaphysical principle,
Mhm.
I think you made this comment. You said, whatever that means. So I think I'd like to clarify, maybe in my own words, for a couple of minutes, what metaphysical means
Mhm.
and clarify it. So it's a term that can have some mystical or mysterious connotations, or can even be said disparagingly. But it's very simple. It really refers directly to a book, one of Aristotle's books called the Metaphysics. And as far as I understand, it was not even the title that Aristotle gave it. It's the Metaphysics is a collection of texts that later on were called the Metaphysics because when students in late antiquity, students were learning about Aristotle and studying Aristotle's thought, they would read the physics first, and then they would read these texts after the physics. And so that collection of texts has been called the Metaphysics. And in the Metaphysics, Aristotle essentially expounds on explanatory principles of not just physical nature, but explanatory principles in general of being, and broadly speaking. And, he points out throughout his works that, you cannot just reduce all explanations of what's going on in life and in nature to physical things, right?
Mhm.
There has to be real principles. So they're real, they're outside, they're not in our mind. It's not just a mental construct or a mental imagination, but there are principles at play that explain the world, explain reality, that are not sensible. They're not sensible. And so by association, we call these things metaphysical principles, right? When we say metaphysical principles, it's things that explain how the world is, but they're not reducible to the material or the physical, if you will. I think that's what I would say for metaphysical. Now, afterwards, specifically in modernity, there have been people who have disagreed with Aristotle on what the explanatory principles of reality are. And so you can use the term metaphysical, even you can say about materialism as being some kind of a metaphysical position, if you will. You can say the metaphysics of materialism essentially reduces to explaining everything in terms of material causes. Or you can have other, like there's a Kantian metaphysics or whatnot. And there are people who disparage the term altogether because they don't want to have anything to do with that. Typically, materialists who will say that materialism doesn't have any metaphysical
Mhm.
aspirations. We're only dealing with material stuff, and therefore we want to banish the term metaphysics out of language or out of philosophy, so to speak. So, but basically, metaphysics, I think I'll take it to mean explanatory principles that are not directly sensible. Okay, they're directly visible, touchable, so physical or material in that sense. So
And meta means beyond, is that right?
beyond or
Literally.
after, right? Either
Yeah.
beyond or
Beneath.
after.
Yeah.
So, so the metaphysics, the book of metaphysics, people assume that it came to be called that because it was studied after the book of
Mhm.
physics, right? Aristotle's book of
Yeah.
physics. Okay. So, having said that, now I want to talk a little bit about the good as a metaphysical principle. Um, and I think the idea here, at least in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, is that the good, something is good, it's a property of things that are out there in real world in real life, that things are good, and something is good when it elicits an attraction or an action, right? That we do an action towards the good. So the ice cream is good and it elicits in me a desire to go and consume it. Okay, my wife is good, it elicits a desire in me to go and get closer to her. um, my health is a good, so it elicits in me a desire to do things to, achieve health or attain health, right? So the good is always out there, and it elicits, it has a power, it's a cause, it's a cause of movement towards
Mhm.
the thing that is good. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because certainly in modernity, in modern culture, the good can be thought about purely something that we deem to be good. Something becomes good because we deem it to be good,
Mhm.
right? We are free to deem something good that is may not be necessarily good, but we
Yeah.
just we so I think it's in philosophical terms, at least in the tradition that I espouse, this Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, the good is a property of things in themselves outside, and they draw our attention, or they elicit a movement in us. So the common good has to be understood in those terms, and that's what Father Brad was explaining
Mhm.
a little bit.
Uh,
And yeah, go ahead, Father Brad.
oh, sorry. I just want to just elaborate on that. I think that's fantastic, Michelle. Thank you. The hang up, the real hang up that a lot of moderns have is in thinking of the good as a cause. We don't think of the good as a cause.
Right.
We think of the good as almost just a subjective preference. But the good is not just a preference. The good is a real cause in nature, but it's not an efficient cause the way a materialist would think. The good is a final cause. And that's the idea. The good always acts as a final cause, which is not an efficient cause, but nonetheless, it's a real cause. And as a cause, it has real effects in the world in the sense of eliciting human love and human action. That's important. So then the common good is a common final cause, an actual cause of community, something that has that ability, not just a public preference, or it's not just a preference that elicits consensus. That's Marxian, but it's an actual cause of social cohesion. That's very important. Uh, and so this is also why what we would call kind of, even it's a false notion, but materialist metaphysics, if you want to call it metaphysics, they deny the idea of a common cause of common community. A community is just an accidental collection, but not an ontological unit that is caused by a real common good or common cause. Does that make sense? I'm saying,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right.
Mhm.
And maybe let me go through the process by which we know that it is a cause. So how do we know? We know it because we observe. That'd be the approach. Or
Yeah,
we observe human beings living in communities.
yeah.
Now, last time we talked a little bit about the division of labor. So it's true that we're totally dependent on the division of labor, and therefore we need each other. But actually, beyond that, that's not sufficient. I was thinking about that. It's not sufficient to come to the term of the political common good, um, because it's not just that we depend on the division of labor, but we actually live in distinct political community. It's a
Hmm.
fact of reality that human beings live in distinct community in which the division of labor proceeds primarily, right? And in a way, the analogy would be, other social animals. So we're not the only social animal. Honeybees or ants live in distinct colonies, right? And so if the beehive, you're right, if there's this beehive and that beehive, and each one has its own common goods, so to speak, that elicits among the bees the natural actions that are such as to maintain the cohesion and the preservation of the beehive. Same thing for the ants, and same thing for human beings, uh, more or less, except that there's evil, and then we disrupt the natural. But there's a natural tendency for human beings to live in distinct political communities. If if it was if our living together was simply explained by the division of labor, then they might be just one humanity, kumbaya, this, and
Hmm.
the idea of the common good would not really emerge. It only emerges because we actually distinguish different political common goods. There's this society and that's, or this city and that city, or this political entity and that political entity. And they go, oh, and the people who live in those political communities naturally, have an affection for that political community, naturally have a desire to remain together and to distinguish themselves from other political communities. It doesn't imply that there's necessarily hostility, but there's certainly a distinction, and that's a natural thing that is in reality. So, how do we explain this natural tendency of human beings to live in distinct political communities? We explain this by the common good. There has to be an explanation. There has to be something that draws the humans to act in this certain way. Otherwise, what we would observe essentially either a big kumbaya of individuals working together, like in a big humanity, or we wouldn't distinguish anything. Maybe humans might be, I mean, it's possible to conceive of human beings as being completely self-sufficient, autonomous, and whatnot, and we barely depend on each other and we each do our own things. But that's not what we see. So what we see in reality, we see humans living in communities that are distinct, and therefore each community has to have its own explanation, and the explanation is the cause, as you said, Father Brad, the
Yes.
common good.
It,
Okay.
does this
Any
highlight?
questions? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was going to make a comment and ask whether I'm understanding what you're saying. But as you describe this, it highlights for me just how the Marxist philosophy denies reality. So they claim that initially that this is scientific socialism, and so it's based purely on consideration of efficient causes, which and in the common language, I come from a scientific background. I'd never heard of efficient causes and final causes of material. That terminology was alien to me. So the scientist, the scientist calls cause in the laws of cause and effect, is an efficient cause. And basically that's the past pushing us forward. Events from the past push us forward. But what the Aristotelian idea says, and brought into Christianity through reading him, is that the future pulls us forward as well, because we have this sense of we desire something in the future, and that pulls us forward. So the past does push. There are efficient causes, but actually they are properly described as working towards aiding the process of moving towards the final cause, which is the purpose. And in human action, that means we imagine we want to do something and we do it. And the way that so Marx claimed to interpret history and see where it was going, but of course what Marx, and so therefore they don't have a sense of the common good as you describe it, and so they don't believe in the reality of different communities as you described. I've never heard what you just said described before, but it's consistent. At least they're consistent, shall we say, in their error, in that because they don't allow for final causes. They believe that it is one big kumbaya. That's what we're heading for, and so they're all internationalists. They're globalists, and they don't believe that the nation is a natural community.
I think you're actually right there. I would only make one amendment to your language. Just one amendment to your language. I think you've got the idea spot on, but it's not the future that draws us, because the future is not a cause. Nor is it the past that pushes, but it's the good that draws us forward.
Okay,
it's the good. It's the good, and it's the common good, and that has an effect now. So even a final cause is not just simply something that is chronologically in my future. A final cause is even in my present, even if it's only intentionally in my intellect. And this is how final causes have real effects in the world now. This is how we have an appetite. We are as all things that have being in metaphysical principles, all things that have the being have a tendency or have an inclination that flows from their form. Natural things have an inclination towards their good. Stones have an inclination towards their natural place, which is the center of the earth. sensible creatures have an inclination towards their sensible good, and then rational creatures finally have an inclination or a tendency or an appetite towards their good. And then we also recognize, following on what Michelle was saying, we can recognize in rational creatures an appetite and action inspired by inclination towards communities, towards specific communities and common goods, or communities that are coherent. And so this implies the necessity of a common cause or a good that is itself a common good. Does that help?
Yeah, very, very happy to accept that. The other thing I was going to say is that that despite the fact that Marxists claim that this is what is driving them, they should just be sitting back and letting it all happen. They don't need to. It's all, you know, it's inevitable. Why do you need revolutionary Marxists to bring this about if it's all going to happen anyway? They acknowledge the very fact that they're campaigning and protesting and agitating, that they have, albeit a distorted sense of what they desire. Is that fair?
I think it's fair, and certainly like a Marxist of the strict observance would say something very similar. Actually, Marx himself, in some of his later writings, I forget what it was, what the writing, it was some of his later writings, he was actually critiquing what he called bourgeois liberalism, which was an attempt to make workers, the attempt of unions to make working conditions better for workers and all the stuff to make. But he was saying actually you're just slowing down the process towards the revolution. This is what he critiqued. So in a certain sense, strict Marxism would agree with you on that one.
Right. And if I want to add something here, but so Marxism, and in fact most modern political theories, but Marxism maybe take it to a certain extreme. So when modernity started to reject these notions of final cause, right, these metaphysical principles, they've become essentially mechanical, right? So the view of the world is like a giant mechanic, and in that framework, yes, you could think of the parts. Even the concept of efficient cause becomes a little bit either redundant or unclear. But essentially, you have parts that are moving according to external forces, right? And then you have inertial motion. So something moves unless it is impeded, right? So it's Newtonian physics translated into social science, if you will, which is of course kind of crazy and unrealistic and self-contradictory and everything else. But that's the idea. The idea in Marxism is that it's sort of mechanical, right? So there's a motion, there are universal laws. If Marx was taking from Hegel this idea of historical determinism, if you will, and it's pushed, but there's no common good. You're right. It's all mechanical and it moves. But you have privileged people like Marx himself who have they have a vision of what it's going to look like, and then they can point in that direction where we're all headed anyways, no matter what. So that's the common good, the political common good. It's a reality. It's an explanatory principle. It's part of reality. It's there, and it inclines us to move or to act in certain ways. Now, rational beings can be mistaken, and we can be and we can be confused, and so we can confuse our own, even our own individual, what the nature of our own individual good is, and confuse what the common good amounts to, and we make mistakes, and that's why we behave in ways that are counterproductive, either to our own individual good or to the common good or to both. I mean, frequently it's both. And we do, we wage unjust wars, or we do things that are bad for our neighbors, who are actually, if we do good to our neighbor, it will help the community, it will help us, and so forth. There's this mutual cause and effect between the individual good and the common good. And but it doesn't mean that the common good doesn't exist, right? The fact that we behave in ways that are counter to it doesn't take away from the fact that it exists. In fact, if anything, it highlights it a little bit better, because we recoil against crime and recoil against things that are obviously bad for our political community. Charlie, does that? I mean, is that helpful to clarify a few of these things?
Yeah, I think that it is. I think that oftentimes in conversations about metaphysics and the common good, it can get divorced in our minds from everyday reality, and it takes I think a certain sort of person to really sit and think these things through. And I'm not even sure that I'm necessarily that kind of person. I think that I prefer to sort of live in the world of at the very least concrete examples. And so I think that, you know, tying it to something like crime rates, or I think even more concretely, and something that is on people's minds, would be something like the culture war. And I think that maybe we could kind of segue a little bit into this conversation about how the common good might relate to the culture war, and specifically what the government's role is, or what politics' role is in mediating between the different factions of the culture war. So, you know, you've got all these hot button issues, and people take different sides, and then there's a tendency for libertarians or classical liberals to take a sort of third position, which is not taking sides in the actual culture war, but saying that these things ought to be fought in the quote unquote cultural arena, not the political arena. The presumption being that you can't legislate morality. And so this is where we might talk a little bit about a couple of articles that have to do with the common good. And should we introduce those here?
Yeah, that sounds great. This is a terrific segue into those articles.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead. Who wants to do that, or do you want to continue, Charlie, and talk about?
Sure, I'll introduce these two articles that the four of us read before this conversation, which both are worth reading. They're both in fairly well-known publications. One is Adrian Vermeulen writing in The Atlantic on common good constitutionalism. And Vermeulen is a professor of constitutional law at Harvard. I think he was at Yale before that. And then the other one is in First Things, which is an ecumenical Christian publication written by a guy named Sohrab Ahmari, who's a Catholic public intellectual, and writing about David French, who's the editor-in-chief of National Review, which has been the standard bearer for conservative and conservative ideas and conservatism since, I don't know, the 80s, and William F. Buckley. But David French allegedly has a certain sentiment or way of presenting conservative arguments that Ahmari takes issue with in this article that's aptly titled "Against David Frenchism." And I know I've seen a lot of people kind of beating up on David French, and I've been tempted to join in the fray at times, because he seems to always make better friends with liberals in the culture war than conservatives, and seems to take his kind of politeness and deference to waging these battles in the cultural arena, not the political arena, to the point where it almost seems like he's siding with the leftists on these culture war issues. Most recently, I think there was this question of whether or not critical race theory should be taught in schools, and David French was saying, he penned an op-ed with a number of prominent kind of left-wing intellectuals saying, by all means, teach this stuff in schools, because it should be, you know, presented in a way that then can be countered by the reasonable conservatives, which is an interesting idea. But I think that there's a general tendency to almost concede the battle before it's even begun. And so maybe we can start with this one, Against David Frenchism, in First Things. How would you guys characterize the argument that he's making, and what am I leaving out?
I think that was great. So you're right. That's exactly the tension, the perpetual tension among conservatives between those who have an understanding of the role of government with respect to the common good that is going to be more limited, and allow, you know, private actors within the political community to you know, to essentially find their ways of flourishing and develop their own ideas of what flourishing, what human flourishing is, and not impose state religion, not impose, uh, you know, certain cultural and moral norms that heavy-handedly. Um, and with the other side, their opponents saying, no, but look, wait a minute. I mean, that's what we've been doing for the last 200 years, and look where we are here. And if anything, it's undermining the common goods. It's certainly creating a society that is more and more immoral by our traditional standards. And so that's Amari's argument. Although he doesn't, unlike the other article by Vermeulen, he doesn't, I think, give any kind of prescription about. He just simply berates David French. At least
Yeah,
David
I think
French's
it's more of
approach.
an admonition. It's
Right.
like a call to war almost, to motivate conservatives to get off the couch and start to actually engage in the culture war battles again, rather than just concede it or try I guess maybe the alternative would be like the Rod Dreher Benedict option, where we just try to carve out these little enclaves. Amari is saying, no, we actually have to go to the front lines and try to position the traditional mores that stem from Christianity at the center of society and fight to keep them there. Because if we just try to have them as one conception of the good alongside many, they'll inevitably get squeezed out by the more libertine ways. And he talks about paganized ideology of the other side, which happens to be also the ruling elite.
Right, but he explicitly, I think, or he implies strongly, but I think it's pretty explicit that there's a role of government in those cultural wars. That it's not. I mean, David French would say let us fight the cultural wars, but let us do it as free individuals, within society, and try to convince and persuade the rest of the population. Whereas Amari is saying, no, I mean, that's, are you kidding me?
Right. He makes a
right.
particular reference to seeing some ad or something to a drag queen story time hour at the Sacramento Public Library. And this is one of those issues that rightly so, I think, gets people up in arms. And here in Berkeley, where I live, if you send your kids into the public school system, you are likely to get a lot of that heavy-handed indoctrination, where the teacher might even be telling your kids that that regardless of what their parents tell them, that in fact they are whatever gender they identify as, which could be very confusing to a 6 or 7 year old kid. And I wonder what David French would say about just the idea of public education in general. Does he support public education? And if so, how is that sort of a level playing field for ideas if it's being funded by the government? And if you do have public education, then why not allow politics to steer it? I actually would have an answer to that, but I'll wait to hear
Great
what you
points.
guys.
I think let's. I propose that we go over Adrian Vermeulen's paper as well, because there's overlap.
Definitely.
And then we can discuss both. But I think these are great questions and points of discussion. Father Brad, you want to talk about Adrian Vermeulen's article?
I can talk briefly about it. He was talking about the title of the article in the Atlantic was Beyond Originalism. And this is as I understand it. Now, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a philosopher, theologian. I'm not a legal scholar. And so I don't know the history of this term to the extent that Vermeulen does in his article. But originalism was a conservative reaction within the legal world, a reaction of the late 70s, early 80s, reaction to the very activist courts of the 40s, 50s, 60s, which gave us, which invented a lot of rights kind of out of thin air, rights that had never existed before, right to privacy, right to abortion, all these things that the more conservative leading people would have thought were these were perversions, as I would agree. And then what emerged in the 80s was something called originalism, or what was called originalism, which was a move to just interpret constitutional law, or to for constitutional law to interpret the words of the Constitution as they were intended by the founders, as almost like a literalism, or as far as I know. Like, again, that might be simplistic, but and so this was the conservative move in the 80s, and then finally won out in the 90s and early 2000s, of to interpret the Constitution in a very strict way as the Constitution would have been intended. And then that interpretation in opposition to an understanding of constitutional law, which sees the word, the actual, the language of the Constitution as something flexible, malleable, the Constitution as a, quote, living document that must be transformed to meet the needs of the time. The actual letter of the Constitution must be flexible and plastic so that it can conform to the exigencies or particular demands of any time. And then that's precisely the nature of the judiciary, is to draw out or distill out of the words of the Constitution a type of meaning that we can then use to fit for our time. That's the opposition to originalism. Now, from what I understand, what Vermeule is arguing is that in the article Beyond Originalism, is that what we see emerging now in the 21st century is a condition of society, conditions in society that demand that we go back to a reading of the Constitution, which allows for the flexibility of the interpretation of the Constitution, allows for the flexibility to meet the demands of our time, what he calls the common good demands of our time, whether it's responding to certain wars, responding to famine, responding to pandemics. That originalism is a straitjacket on the interpretation of law. That's how I would sum the article.
Yeah, and I think Vermeule had me until the very end. Actually, I was really kind of nodding my head along in agreement in a lot of sections where he's talking about really what would the founders' understanding of authority have been, and what would their understanding of liberty have been, and sort of seeing how the modern conception, the libertarian conception of freedom as the freedom to do whatever you want without any regard for morals or norms, that this would have been rejected by the founders, and that they would find our current situation sort of unrecognizable. And so in looking for a more solid ground for authority, which maybe can take some positive steps toward not enforcing the common good, but cultivating the common good. That's another thing that is echoed in Amari's piece, is this idea of institutions that are not created by government, but that are cultivated and nurtured by government. I think that it's tempting, but then the catch is that once you accept this argument, suddenly you have to agree on what counts as the common good. And so Vermeule takes it in the direction of, clearly the government has a compelling interest in mandating a national vaccine requirement. And, this kind of thing, I think that it quickly gets into this slippery slope where it can become totalitarian very fast. Once, if you think, hey, I like this Vermeule guy, he's a traditional Catholic, and he is out there fighting for the common good, and he's even got a place to stand in the Atlantic. He's able to speak to the ruling elites in a way that they can understand, because he's Harvard, Yale educated, all this stuff. But then you realize that there's kind of I don't want to call him a wolf in sheep's clothing, but I do think that he slips that in at the end.
Charlie, I'll go ahead and call him a wolf in sheep's clothing for you. I'll just go ahead and do it for you, because I kind of smelled it from the beginning of the article. I was kind of like you, kind of intrigued at the very beginning, but then I smelled they're constantly using the common good. It's a type of totalitarian move where it's always using the phrase the common good without any real concrete notion of what the common good is, which then gives one a sense, or gives a lawmaker a sense of license to simply do whatever the lawmaker desires, under the auspices of the common good. And that's very dangerous. I think it's incredibly dangerous. I also think he pulled a move, which I'm very suspicious of saying that, well, the founding fathers had one notion of freedom that then the 19th century had a different notion of freedom that was wrong. And so we have to re-import another notion of freedom, almost as if notions of freedom are like tinker toys or toy blocks that we can simply substitute one out for another and find whichever tinker toy has the right shape for creating our type of society, and then we use that one. It's very dangerous. I think it's a recipe for totalitarianism to simply say that we need the words, the actual letter of the Constitution, to be flexible enough to be able to meet the needs of the common good of our time. Okay, who decides what that is? That's a real danger. And whose common good are you talking about? As Terence, the Roman senator, would say, quis custodiat ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guardians? And which common good are we talking about? Now, I would completely agree with him that a more 18th century notion of freedom is distinct and incomplete from a true metaphysical notion of freedom as held by Aristotle and St. Thomas. Freedom is not license. And I do disagree with the libertarian notion of freedom as license, but not because it's entirely wrong, but because it's incomplete. It's just incomplete. Freedom is teleological. Freedom must be ordered to the good. Freedom, true freedom, can only be truly free if it's ordered to the good. But this does not mean that the state will simply hold out a carrot to me called the good, and then tell me, listen, Father Brad, you're gonna act towards the good no matter what, and then you're gonna be free and you're gonna like it. Mm-hmm. That's very dangerous. At that point, we're simply taking the word tyranny and respelling it freedom. But it's the same word. It's tyranny that's just respelled freedom. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the word, doesn't change the meaning. It's a type of tyranny. Right. And it's so tempting for traditional Catholics to simply want to substitute one mafia for another, that we have our mafia, and so we're going to substitute a secular mafia for our mafia. We're just going to impose a type of good that is the real good because we know it's the real good. And then people are going to act towards that, and they're going to be free, and they're going to like it.
And the justification that they often use is a distortion, actually, of freedom. But a different distortion. Rather than saying it's pure license, they're saying it's pure end, in a sense.
But that's a good point. Yeah.
So that they're saying that you are free if we make you do what is good, and of course, we know what's good is the assumption, or the church. We're consistent with what the church says. Therefore, we can impose freedom. And it's just a contradiction in terms. It still has to be freely chosen, and people have to have the possibility of opting out, in effect, if they're free.
Let me. That sounds it's very good. But I want to read, just to be fair to him, I want to read some passages, a couple of passages, so then, and maybe use those to then reflect back on what's the understanding of the common good that we had presented, that you presented, Father Brad, and so forth. So let me read this. This approach, meaning constitutional or common good constitutionalism, this approach should take as its starting point substantive moral principles that conduce to the common good. These principles include respect for the authority of rule and rulers, respect for the hierarchies needed for society to function, solidarity within and among families, social groups, and workers' unions, trade associations, and professions, appropriate subsidiarity and respect for the legitimate roles of public bodies and associations at all levels of government and society, and a candid willingness to legislate morality. So that's how he described it. And then he says that this is, he says it's not legal positivism. He defends. I'm not sure that he makes the case that it's not legal positivism, meaning it's not the that the ruler is not going to impose this as that the law is supposed to follow the natural law, as opposed to the state making the law be what the law is, right? The law is supposed to conform to natural law. So anyway, so he said it's not legal positivism, it's not legal liberalism or libertarianism. And then he says, there's another passage that I thought was important. Constitutional law must afford broad scope for rulers to promote as the ragion di stato, the reason of state, right? He appeals to that notion of reason of state. As the ragion di stato, region of state, put it in a famous trinity of principles, meaning the traditional concept of reason of state was peace, justice, and abundance. But then he says, today we may add health and safety to that list in very much the same spirit. In a globalized world that relates to the natural and biological environment in a deeply disordered way, a just state is a state that has ample authority to protect the vulnerable from the ravages of pandemics, natural disasters, and climate change, and from the underlying structures of corporate power that contribute to these events. So, I wanted to talk about, or maybe Father Brad or anyone, how does he understand I mean, how different is it, his notion of the common good, and how it is being promoted from the way we should understand the common good? And does promotion of the common good even make sense if the common good is a cause, a natural cause that is there in reality?
Yes.
Does it even make sense, or how are we to understand what it means to promote the common good? Does the common good need a little extra boost, or?
Well, I would say, Michelle, that's the question. So that's a great question. And as a philosopher, theologian, I would say the common good is not an artificial reality created by the state. The common good is a natural. It begins, but the political common, before it's a political reality, it begins as a natural metaphysical principle of goodness that's drawing all things by their very natures towards it. And the common good must be protected. But the common good is not something that the state can compel, nor is the common good something that the state can create. This is a danger. The state is there to protect the common good. And insofar as doing that, we can actually call it a promotion of the common good, because it can promote those principles, or as the Second Vatican Council would say, the conditions necessary for the flourishing of groups within society. But the state does not create the common good, nor is the state synonymous with the common good. This is a real post-Hegelian Marxian notion of the common good, that the common good is the state. The state is the common good. So that, and then you take the common good and the individual and you separate them, almost as if the common good is distinct from the good of the individual. The individual then is just simply that egg that can be cracked in order to make an omelet. And it's the individual and individual liberty that suffers in that notion of the common good. Because the common good is first a metaphysical principle, every individual freely moves towards it, whether they know it or not, And those conditions that allow the individual and the family and smaller groups in society to freely move towards the common good in search of their own proper good, the more the common good flourishes. This is like, I agree with a lot of what Vermeulen was saying, but then he throws those things in there that I think he just crosses a line.
I'm just going to throw an example at you then. If we can't legislate for morality, which is that's kind of what you're saying, is it contrary to?
No, I wouldn't exactly say that we can't legislate morality. We have to then just define morality, what we meant of it. Not all, St. Thomas would say, and there's others would say, not all evil can be proscribed, and not all acts of virtue can be mandated by law. It simply can't be. So in that sense, we can't legislate all morality. That does not mean that every single law is based upon some notion of the good. If we don't have a notion of the good already, if we don't have some kind of a common notion of the human good, then we couldn't even have the beginnings of law. So in a certain sense, all law is about morality, but in a more practical sense, the law cannot punish all vice. It cannot outlaw all vice, nor can it promote all acts of virtue by human positive law. That's not what human positive law can do without becoming tyrannical.
At the risk of wading into kind of sticky territory, I wanted to draw some attention to one line in particular from the Amari piece, where he's referencing a Supreme Court decision of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and I'm actually blanking on the details of that case. But I don't know if that was it's an abortion case. It's not Roe v. Wade, but it's one that I think maybe established. Anyone know
it may
that?
be a contraception case. I'm not.
Maybe could be contraception.
Right.
Okay. But he's, and I'm looking for the section of the article, but there was, in the majority decision in that case, there was language about everyone being able to decide for themselves what the ultimate meaning of the universe is. I still can't find it, but basically, and this has shown up time and time again in Supreme Court decisions, where the justices seem to fashion themselves as the ultimate kind of philosopher kings, and thinking that, well, but to the extent that there's kind of a relativism built into it, where each individual is supposed to be the arbiter of truth and the common good.
Right. So just for clarification, it is an abortion case. It was in 1992. The court upheld the constitutional right to have an abortion that was established in Roe v. Wade, but altered the standard for analyzing restrictions on that right, crafting the undue burden standard for abortion restrictions. So,
and I was actually mistaken. It was in the Vermeulen article where he writes that the claim from the notorious opinion in Planned Parenthood v. Casey that each individual may, quote, define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. It's very lofty language, but covering up a sort of superficiality, really.
Right, but I think that the difficulty here is that Amari and Vermeulen, maybe in different ways. So I don't know exactly how Amari would feel about Vermeulen's proposal, but they would say that I mean, if it is important to protect the common good, there are behaviors that will undermine it eventually. You know, I mean, if we agree that we want to maintain, the Christian worldview, the traditions of Christianity, and a certain worldview, there are behaviors that will undermine it. And so what do you say to that? And therefore, there is reason of state, if you will, to try to intervene and prescribe these things that are, according to them, objectively injurious, or at least harmful to the common good.
I can respond to that a little bit, Michelle. I would just simply say, repeat what I think I've said before in previous episodes, that we have to resurrect a robust understanding of subsidiarity. And there's a difference between communities having control over smaller communities, or smaller villages having control over their education, for example, and then having something mandated by federal law. I think in smaller communities absolutely have every right to control. That's what I would say.
And that's your answer to the critical race theory problem. It's not to, I mean, unfortunately, we might have to fight at the government level to say what happens in public schools, but really this should be something that parents should be deciding for their children.
Ultimately, that is what I would, my answer to the critical race theory. So even I would actually, maybe surprisingly, kind of take a position between French and his critics on critical race theory. And this is why also, Charlie, I always balk at the phrase culture war a little bit. I balk a little bit because a war is precisely something that governments wage against other governments. And you don't have a war unless you have a state declare it. States don't create cultures. Governments don't create cultures. Culture is something that emerges from human society. So when we talk about cultural war, I think that automatically puts us in the playing field, thinking that we must, by necessity, that the only solution to something like critical race theory is for the heavy hand of government to come down. And I think that might be that certainly might be a solution. That might be our only solution. because I agree, critical race theory is absolutely poison, and it must be eradicated. But I think the heavy use of the government hand here is establishing the conditions of that might be a greater evil at the end. I don't know. That's what I would say. And I think critical race theory can never be promoted by the government, nor simply prescribed by the government. That's what I would say. But
Yeah, I would. I mean, I
There's
think. Go ahead, Charlie. Yeah.
I was just going to refer to a line that I like by a writer and thinker. I think he's at the Claremont Institute, named John Mariani, and he talks about how in classical liberal circles it's common for there to be this kind of unmanly contempt for politics, not necessarily advocating for using the heavy hand of government, but to say that, to roll back, say, the regulations of the administrative state, or to make serious reform to the educational system, you have to use political levers. That we can't just wait for some sort of emergent order type of solution to come down for these things. And then in some cases, there might not be an existing coalition or enough political will to solve these problems. But that's where the admonition to build that coalition, I think, comes from. And Amari's describing he's calling for conservatives to consider that we can't go back to the pre-2016 conservative coalition of the deregulation coupled with evangelical Christian or whatever that Reagan alliance was, which I think in the end morphed more and more toward the side of just neoliberalism and deregulation, more so than the issues that might have been more on the minds of the evangelical Christians. So in terms of thinking about what that political coalition might look like or where they draw their inspiration from, that's where I think that we want to avoid the contempt for politics, although being careful not to fall prey to the temptation of government as the solution, more so thinking of politics as the means to put government in its place.
And I would say that this is something that often occurs, is that people think that the stand that we seem to be taking here is laissez-faire. It's just saying we don't, get rid of the government, just let things happen. That we need strong system of law, and and we really need to fight for them. But the question, but rather than aiming to get control of the government and just get our guys in instead of their guys, get our judges in instead of their judges. I mean, that's part of it, but it's a question of what the goal you're aiming for is. And I would say that it's this conception of freedom as well as the idea of subsidiarity. In other words, what the natural role of government is, that is important. So we do need to get into the arena of politics, as you're saying, Charlie, to deal with this critical race theory problem. But the answer is not then to start mandating what public schools do and just come up with a different mandate. It is to aim for the proper authority over the schools, which is through subsidiarity. So, and you need positive government to do that. You need people who are really involved in the political process.
I agree, but I would go further. I think the aim should be to abolish public education.
Oh,
Because public education is not a promotion of the common good, right? So it's a complete misunderstanding of the common good to think that because if these conservatives think that all we need to do is have public schools teach Christian morality and Christian values or whatever conservative values, that is antithetical to the common good. It's an assault on the common good.
But my point is that requires positive political action.
Yeah, correct. It may be. I mean, it's
laissez-faire at all. It's to emerge out of nothing. We have to create the conditions, and I agree. Abolish government education, state education. Yeah.
Right. That's the only way. Because if it weren't for public education, there's no way that critical race theory would be taught today, or that that we would have that shift to liberalism. Public education by itself is so. As I said, public education, public health,
Yeah.
education and health are private goods. They're individual goods. You
Amen.
don't educate, right, generically a community. You educate individuals. It's to the benefit of the health is an individual good. So the whole notion of public health is fallacious, and it should be so. I mean, I could have my constitution say that the role of the government is precisely to protect the common good, properly understood, and
But
and
and therefore it is important that this battle is never going to go away. There's the desire to control and make people do what I want them to is in
right,
every person. So
right. But I would say that I won't. I mean, I mean, when you say the political activism, I mean, part of it has to be cultural as well. I mean, meaning
yes,
by private means to try to convince, to persuade people that our understanding of the common good
yeah.
is better than their understanding of the common good. Whether
Which
it
brings
promotes,
yeah, because in Britain, of course, health is just I've mentioned this before. That you cannot criticise the idea of the national health system. You might argue about how it's run, but the idea that it shouldn't be there is a heresy that virtually no politician could ever. I don't think even Farage would dare say
right,
that.
and it shows you how corrupting these social
Yeah.
programs have been, and how they're against individual freedom, because now they're all dependent. They have
Yeah.
this massive dependence. Go
But
ahead,
the
sorry.
argument would be, but at least we get a good, I'm not worried about when I get ill. I know I can go to hospital. And so the argument I would make would be, well, no, you'll have better health generally.
Right, exactly.
You actually will have better health. And the evidence I would use is that if you look at food, I mean, you can't get anything more necessary to life than food. And the government doesn't get involved in distributing that. And no one would even want that to happen. Or actually, where it does, it's of course probably subsidies and all that sort of thing. But for the most part, that I don't know if it has the same connotation in this country, but that we did have mandatory school dinners when I went to junior school and senior school. These are we don't have the same school system. And they are just sort of famous for being the most disgusting meals you'd ever have. Everyone wants to get exemption from them and get the parents to give you sandwiches or something. But the argument I would make in Britain is that the argument you're making, we have a health system which is is the equivalent, if it were food, where everybody gets state mandated dinners, basically. And it'd be a disaster. It'd be horrible food, and there'd be shortages, and no one would be getting it, and that's effectively what we have in the health system. The fear is unfounded.
Right, but it's amazing how we fall in love with these ideas and these ideals that are right. Even it's you can look at reality and it's terrible, but we fall in love with this idea. Of that, the good is things to be doled out from one to the, taken from some, redistributed, given to others. It's really damaging to both the common good and the individual good, right? So it undermines. So now, see, I wanted to bring that up because our own notion of the common good, I mean, even on an emotional level, has been so eroded by modernity that now we have this question of dual citizenship, right? I mean, our allegiance to our country is so weak.
Yeah.
We can, we can, I change citizenship, like, whatever my whims. And I like your common good better. Let me go and live in Greece or Italy or South America and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so it's it ends up, right. I mean, it's a long battle because these anti-true common goods forces have been at play for centuries, and they've corrupted our culture, broadly speaking, at a very, very fundamental level. Yes. We've become enamored with a very narrow license to do what we want with our lives, in very narrow ways, and extremely dependent on the state for other things like healthcare and whatnot, and it's almost it's hard to see, practically speaking, how to get out of that bind.
I think it's a problem not just of culture, but ultimately of evangelization. Without faith, there is
Right.
the
Yeah,
fear
absolutely.
is too great.
Amen.
if I can comment on that, and maybe if I just kind of put a cherry on top of everything we're saying, it's like ultimately, because the common good is a common final cause, it has to be love. And for Aristotle, the purpose of education was to develop virtue so that a person could love the common good. What we've seen now is an erosion of education through public education. Public education has eroded the true love of the common good. And so now people call common goods what are actually individual goods, and they love the individual good. And if people do not have the virtue or the training to love the common good, they will eventually only love individual goods, and that will destroy society. People love their own healthcare, which is theirs. That's an individual good. People love their education. It's an individual good. People need their food. It's an individual good. People look to government. People look to government to give them individual goods. And that means that we have created, through lack of education, a citizenry that is incapable of loving the common good and really striving for the common good. Yeah. And so ultimately, what it gets down to is, like you said, David, an evangelization, a rekindling our understanding that there is actually a God. There is a God, an extrinsic common good of the whole universe, which is a good that we can all work towards, and truly learn to love common goods. And then in the process, learn to be human, learn to be truly human. So.
And then the question is, how do we evangelize? And I think the answer is, we had Father giving us a talk on. It's about happiness. We can be happier. There's greater happiness in.
No, the government needs to give me happiness.
Choice we can make, and it's a happy one.
Right. Well, that's great. Any final thoughts, Charlie or David?
No, fantastic. Love what you said.
That was terrific. Okay, we'll pursue more conversations, interesting conversations on that nature next time.
Okay.